Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Good afternoon. It's Susan Coffin. I'm here for Attitude Magazine's almost weekly ADHD Experts webinar series. Thanks for joining us today. Our presentation is called A Parent's Guide to Neurofeedback for ADHD, and we're very pleased to welcome our two expert guest speakers today, Dr. David Rabiner and Dr. Ed Hamlin. I think it's safe to say that most readers of Attitude are uncertain as to what precisely neurofeedback does, what it is, and whether or how it actually results in improved attention or reduced hyperactivity or impulsive behavior. Researchers have been studying neurofeedback since the 70s, and there are a fair number of studies supporting its efficacy for ADHD, and yet parents are still uncertain as to whether to pursue it for their children. So we're pleased to welcome Drs. Rabiner and Hamlin today. We hope they'll end some of the mystery around neurofeadback and enlighten us on such topics as how long neurofeedback's actually been used to treat ADHD, what the research says in support of it as a treatment for ADHD, what it is, what the basics of it, a neurofeedback treatment is, including what it costs and how many sessions parents typically do with their children, what results you should expect to see in your children with ADHD if you do try neurofeedback, whether neurofeedback should be combined with medication or behavior therapy or should be used alone, and then home-based neurofeedback systems. I want to mention to all of you that the Attitude website now has something called treatment reviews. If you go to the treatment tab, explore treatments, you'll see medication and treatment review section. And we invite anyone who has tried neurofeedback to post their experience with it there so that you can share it with the community. I think it's a big service. So thank you so much for joining us today. David Rabiner, Ph.D., is a research professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University, where he currently serves as the Associate Dean in Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. He has published over 50 peer-reviewed papers on all aspects of ADHD, and he publishes a very well-regarded online newsletter called Attention Research Update that's available for sign-up at www.helpforadd.com. Ed Hamlin, Ph.D., is the founder and clinical director of the Institute for Applied Neuroscience based in Asheville, North Carolina, where he specializes in the application of neuroscience techniques to address a wide range of issues, including attention problems. He has received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology from UNC, Chapel Hill, and taught there and Duke before returning to Asheville. He specializes in the applied neuroscience techniques to help attention, cognitive disorders, depression, anxiety, and has trained thousands of clinicians to use neurofeedback. Together, he and Dr. Rabiner are the co-developers of Nervanics Insight, and they will mention that briefly in our presentation. Let me thank the sponsor of our webinar, Play Attention. Play Attention is the only brain training system that combines both advanced neurofeedback with cognitive training. There have been 3 randomized controlled studies to confirm that Play Attention effectively improves attention, behavior, and learning skills in both children and adults. Play Attention is available for both home and personal use. And for more information, please visit Play Attention's website, www.playattention.com. Thank you, Play Attention. So with that, let me turn it over to our speakers. And again, with our welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello. Hi, this is Ed Hamlin, and I appreciate your interest. I appreciate you being here. So I've been involved in the practice of neurofeedback since the mid-'70s. It hasn't been around much longer than that. So I've been around about as long as it has. And the first question most people ask is, well, what's the difference between neurofeedback and biofeedback? And there's not really a difference. It's that neurofeedback is a specific form of biofeedback where you may use in biofeedback, you may be using muscle tension or skin temperature. In neurofeedback, we use the EEG. So one of the things that happens during neurofeedback sessions is the person is learning to change the activation patterns in their brain. And the activation is reflected in the EEG activity. So brainwave frequencies are measured by speed, by the speed of the firings of the brain cells. And so the very slowest firings in the brain cells are the delta waves. And the delta waves are what is typically present when you're asleep. As you move up, the next area of brainwaves is called theta. They use the Greek alphabet to designate these frequency bandwidths. It's a little faster than delta. It's usually between about 4 and 8 cycles per second, where delta is 0 to 4. And so it goes along with being deeply relaxed, a deep meditation state, or when you're really in a reverie and daydreaming and you're picturing the last trip you took to the beach, or an upcoming vacation, you're imagining yourself there. That would be, your brain would be primarily in a state of theta activity. Alpha activity is relaxed. It's an open focus. It's not paying a close attention to your thoughts or the narrative going on in your head. It's really just taking in something that might be present when you're sitting on your deck or outside watching the sunset and just appreciating the colors and the sounds that are in the air. That's also a very pleasant state to refresh yourself during the day. The state called SMR is a low beta state. It's where you are calm but alert. And your awareness is heightened during this state. It's a good state to be in while you're listening to this webinar. It's a good receptive state for taking in information. Faster than that is the beta state, and the beta state is associated with processing of information. So it's actually a good problem-solving state to be in. If you're doing calculations or things like that, that's the way you'd want to do it. So when you're balancing your checkbook, you hope you're in a beta state. When you're trying to find your way in traffic in an unfamiliar area, you hope you're in a beta state. And every time I fly, I always hope my air traffic controllers are in a strong beta state. And so those are the frequency bandwidths. And those are what we are training when we use neurofeedback. So here's a typical setup for doing this. You have a person who has sensors placed on their scalp. There's nothing invasive, so the sensors are placed on the scalp. And then you also have sensors on the ears for grounding your signal and for referencing the signal to the other electrical activity that's going on in your body. And so it picks up on the brain's activity. And the therapist who's doing the neurofeedback session is actually looking at the brain waves. So they're looking at at the content of the brain waves that are being picked up. And so just like all of those frequencies that we were just looking at, all of those frequencies are present all the time. The thing that changes are proportions. So even when you are wide awake, you still have some of the brain waves associated with sleep going on in your brain. Hopefully you don't have very many of those, but you do have them. And conversely, when you're sound asleep, you have some of the faster frequency activity going on in your brain. Hopefully you just don't have very much of it, or you won't be sleeping very well. So the therapist is actually looking at those different brain waves that are being produced. What we do with the training is we try to reduce the things there are too much of and increase the things there may not be enough of. For instance, the most typical pattern that you find for both children and adults that have attention deficit disorder is an excess of slow frequency activity. So the alpha and the theta activity in particular are the things that you may see elevated in the brain. So though those states are good for reveries or daydreaming or for relaxing, general relaxation, they're not very good for taking in information and processing it. So typically what we're doing is we're encouraging the person to learn to inhibit those and to make more of those beta range activities that are good for external focus. So it would be pretty useless to tell someone just to do that. So what we do is we give them a video display, a video and audio display that tells them when they're doing more of the desired activity and also tells them when they're doing more of the undesired activity. So through that process, the person learns to be able to alter those patterns in their brainwave activity. So here's an example of measuring the activity throughout the head. So you can see there's the nose up here and the left and right ears on the side of it. And these are 4 different individuals. So these are 4 completely different individuals. And where you see all that red activity up in the front of the head, primarily in the middle in front of the head, it's showing an excess of that slow frequency activity we were just talking about. And after neurofeedback training, when you measure that same activity, you see significant reduction. In some of the people, it's almost gone. In others, you still see a little of it, but less than before. So in this case, these people have learned to alter the activation patterns in their EEG activity. So a typical course of neurofeedback training, if I can say a typical course, because there are a variety of approaches to doing this, but a typical course of the neurofeedback training is it involves an assessment. And the assessment is a good assessment will always involve measuring the proportions of those different brain waves that exist in the recording. And you don't have to have the full quantitative EEG that I was just showing you that involves putting 19 sensors on the brain and recording all of the patterns. You can put 1 or 2 sensors on the brain and record the activity and get similar measurements that you would find with the full process. So typically the assessment is going to include EEG measurements, and then you want to get a baseline of where that individual is functioning. So you typically do that with rating scales. So there's several different rating scales out there, but essentially it's looking at focus, activity levels, impulsivity, those type things. And so you get a baseline of those. Then the person begins the neurofeedback training, and it is individualized to those measurements that were taken originally. When I was describing the pattern that you typically find, it involves an excess of slow frequency activity, and as the brain map showed you, primarily in the front of the brain. But there are other patterns that you find. So it's not that everyone who has ADD or ADHD has the same pattern. Sometimes there's an excess of fast frequency activity in the front of the brain. And those are the folks that you see who often have more impulsivity, hyperactivity in their behavior, and not the spacey, daydreamy type that you sometimes see with ADD. But if that's the pattern, your measurements will show you those things, and you can specifically target that with the training. Typically, most of the research that's been done, and actually most of the clinical practice that's done, has shown that it takes between 20 and 40 sessions for an individual to learn to make lasting changes in their EEG activity. So they may be able to make changes in their EEG activity earlier than that, but it typically doesn't last. So like learning to play a musical instrument or learning any other skill, it often takes repetitive practice. And one thing we know about neuroplasticity is frequency, intensity, and duration of practice is what results in neuroplastic changes. So the sessions number between 20 and 40. It takes about 30 minutes of training, and usually the person's pooped out after 30 minutes, so it's not likely that you could be able to train effectively a lot longer than that, because it does take work to do this, work for the brain. And so it tends to have an effect, and even initially it may not be able to be 30 minutes. It may have to work up to 30 minutes. But eventually the brain is tired and will begin to revert, and so you don't want to train longer than the brain is effectively learning. And then you periodically are doing reassessment. So you can take those measurements periodically, make sure that you're seeing the changes in the desired direction that you want to see, and follow along with the rating scales. So as you're doing this, you're continually reassessing as you go along. The cost of these sessions varies significantly across the country. The range that I'm aware of runs from about $40 a session to about $150 a session. So it really depends on the area of your country, and it depends some on the practitioner. The downside of this is it typically isn't covered by insurance. So a lot of the expense for this tends to be out of pocket. Therefore, you would like to have that periodic reassessment done so that you know you're not doing any more than you need to do. So it shouldn't be, you wouldn't want to have a specified number of sessions required. There may be a minimum number of sessions, but with the assessment, you could tell if you're in the training range that you hope to achieve by doing this.
As you just heard from Dr. Hamlin about sort of the basic EEG underpinnings of neurofeedback, and sort of the premise behind it is that as people learn to transform their typical pattern of brainwave activity through training, that results in changes in their behavior, and specifically for people with ADHD, it results in reductions in their ADHD symptoms in real-world settings. So what's important about this treatment, or really any treatment, is not just that you would see changes in brainwave activity during the training, or even that there would be changes in brainwave activity that extend beyond training, but that those changes are associated with meaningful improvements in children's ability to sort of focus and attend in school and when they're needing to do their work. So as Ed mentioned, neurofeedback's been around for a long time, since the 70s. There were case studies that began to be published in the mid-70s using neurofeedback for ADHD. And really since then, dozens of studies, really hundreds of studies, looking at the impact of neurofeedback training on ADHD. And over time, the methodology of those studies really has gotten stronger. I'm going to just talk briefly about some representative types of neurofeedback studies, give you a sense of the kind of work that's been done, what some of the limitations of that work are. So there was a study published back in 2002 by a psychologist by the name of Vince Monastra. And what he did is he started with 100 6 to 19-year-olds, all diagnosed with ADHD. They were treated for 12 months with a combination of medication, behavior therapy, school consultation, and half of the parents of those children and teenagers opted to include neurofeedback as part of their child's treatment. So this was not a random assignment where you flip a coin to determine who gets neurofeedback added to the treatment or not. This was the choice made by parents. At the end of the year, what he found is that those youth who had neurofeedback included in their treatment, on top of the other components that the others were receiving, they were doing really substantially better based on what parents reported about their behavior, what teachers reported about their behavior. They looked better on computerized tests of attention. And when he repeated this kind of EEG measure to look at how their brainwave activity had changed over time, essentially what he found is that the EEG scans for those who received the neurofeedback treatment were essentially normalized. So they no longer look different from what you would see in youth without ADHD. When you ended medication and retested within a week, the benefits for those who had received neurofeedback continued. For those youth who had not had neurofeedback, after a week off of meds, they were sort of benefits that they had dissipated. So the problem with that study was, one of the problems was the absence of random assignment. There was a study published back in 2006 with a smaller study with 28 to 12-year-old children. Here they were randomly assigned. They were randomly assigned to either receive neurofeedback treatment or to a waitlist control condition, so essentially they got no treatment. There were 40 weekly neurofeedback sessions of about a 30-minute duration, as Ed had mentioned. And at the end of those 40 weeks, those sessions, those children who received neurofeedback, they were doing significantly better on parent ratings of ADHD symptoms. They were doing significantly better than the control children on laboratory measures of attention, which would be more objective measures of attention. And then what was particularly interesting, they did fMRI scans of these participants as they were engaged in a fairly complicated cognitive task. And what they saw was that the patterns of brainwave activation actually looked now significantly different in those who had received the neurofeedback treatment compared to the control group. So this study was a nice study in that it had random assignment and it had these objective measures of brainwave activity that showed the real changes resulting from neurofeedback. There was a study a little bit more recently, back in 2009, another fairly large study with over 100 8 to 12-year-olds diagnosed with ADHD. Here they were randomly assigned to neurofeedback or to another active treatment, computerized attention training. So rather than just there being a waitlist control group, this was sort of an active treatment group to which neurofeedback was being compared. 36 session over 18 weeks. They made an effort here to try to keep the parents and teachers of these children blind. And what we mean by that is that they tried very hard so that neither the parents nor the teachers knew which type of treatment the children were receiving. What they found was that compared to those getting just the computerized attention training, those who received neurofeedback showed greater reductions in both parent and teacher ratings of ADHD symptoms. The size of that difference between the groups was reasonably large, kind of a moderate effect size. They also, what was a nice aspect of this study is they followed these participants 6 months after treatment ended, and what they found was that the benefits of the neurofeedback remained evident according to the ratings provided by their parents. They didn't collect follow-up teacher ratings. And also that the parents of children who received the neurofeedback reported fewer homework difficulties compared to the children who got the computerized attention training. This study done about 4 years ago compared neurofeedback to stimulant medication treatment. Fairly small study, 24 7 to 14-year-olds, and this was another random assignment study, which is nice. So essentially, they flipped a coin to see who got the meds and who got the neurofeedback. 40 theta-beta training sessions or methylphenidate. And what they found in this study was that both groups showed significant reductions in parent ratings of ADHD symptoms and teacher ratings of ADHD symptoms. That was evident immediately after treatment ended. It was evident also 2 months later and at 6 months follow-up. In addition, those who received the neurofeedback also showed significant improvement in teachers' reports of their reading and writing skills. It's not 100% clear if teachers were blind. So what I mean by that, it's not clear that the teachers were not able to find out who got the medication and who was getting the neurofeedback. So there have been enough studies that have emerged over the years to do what are called meta-analyses. And in a meta-analysis, rather than essentially looking at the results from any individual study, what the researchers do is they find studies that meet certain kinds of criteria in terms of their methodological strength, and they essentially analyze the data from across those different studies in a way that sort of combines them to try to give you a more reliable estimate about what the true impact of an intervention is, rather than trying to make a conclusion based on a single study. So back in 2012, based on 14 different randomized trials of neurofeedback for ADHD, what they found were effect sizes in terms of reducing ADHD symptoms of nearly 0.8 for inattention, a little over 0.7 for hyperactivity. Those would be considered fairly robust effects. They're not quite as high as the effect sizes that you would see typically for stimulant medication, which are usually right around 1. So good size effects, not quite as large as for medication. They did caution that what they're referring to as triple blinding in these studies was infrequent. What they mean by triple blinding is that nobody associated with the study essentially knows if, for example, the children getting neurofeedback are actually getting real feedback on their brainwave activity, or whether it's kind of sham feedback, so the experience of the kids getting the neurofeedback treatment or not is exactly the same. They're wired up the same way. They go through the same protocol. Only one group is actually getting true feedback on their brainwave activity, and the other is more kind of random. They concluded, based on these meta-analysis of these 14 different trials, was that neurofeedback was probably efficacious. Not definitely, but that there's a good basis for believing that it has positive impacts on ADHD symptoms. Now, more recently, just last year, there was a meta-analysis on 13 trials, randomized controlled trials, some of which were part of that first meta-analysis that I just described. And what they tried to do is they tried to look at, well, what is the impact if you base it on reports from raters who probably know whether or not the children were getting the neurofeedback treatment, and how does that compare to the results if you look at ratings from people who did not know, who were probably blind, who were probably unaware. And their conclusion is that, yes, you see nice effects from raters who were not blinded, who were probably aware that treatment was being received. But when you sort of isolate what you look at to reports from people who were blind, who did not know, that those effects are diminished substantially. So that's obviously less supportive of the impact of neurofeedback treatment. So, should neurofeedback be a first-line or a standalone treatment for ADHD? This is a question that I've gotten frequently from parents. I think what's important to emphasize there is, at the moment, the research support for both stimulant medication treatment and for behavior therapy, I think most people in the field would agree that it's stronger for those two interventions than it is for neurofeedback. It's also important to recognize that even for children who benefit from neurofeedback, the benefits take time to emerge. And so if you've got a child where the symptoms are, particularly when they're pretty severe, and that child is struggling every single day, you may not have the luxury of waiting 4, 6, 8 weeks for neurofeedback to take effect, as opposed to something like medication, where oftentimes the effects are positive and immediate. And then just as you wouldn't typically recommend any treatment as a standalone treatment for ADHD, the same would be true for neurofeedback. Most youth with ADHD are likely to benefit more from kind of a combined or multimodal treatment approach than from a single treatment alone. So what about home-based training? So this is something that became possible probably 5, 6 years ago. There are now these wireless EEG headsets. There's a picture of one right there. That particular headset you can get for under $100, and what it does is it reads a child's brainwave activity, in this case from a single sensor on the forehead, transmits that activity wirelessly via Bluetooth to a laptop or tablet PC, and provides feedback on brainwave activity in the same way as Dr. Hamlin was talking about. There'll be different things that happen on the computer screen depending on the pattern of brainwave activity that's being produced. Obviously, compared to 20 to 40 sessions that may run $50, $60, $100 per session, this is far more convenient. You can do it in your home, far less costly. As I mentioned, the headset here is about $100. There are hundreds of different training apps that are out there, some of which are free. I would note that all of the research that I just sort of summarized, which is really a fraction of what's out there, it's all based on in-office neurofeedback training. I actually just came across the first published study that I've seen yesterday looking at kind of the impact of home-based training. So the research based on home-based neurofeedback training does not yet exist. One thing that I'd note, and this is true about neurofeedback in general, but particularly for most of the apps that are developed along with these home-based kind of headsets, is that the training typically occurs in the context of video game-like tasks. And you could argue that paying attention during those kinds of game-log tasks, that's not really an academically relevant context. And wouldn't it make more sense in some ways to provide feedback on EEG indicators of attention while kids are doing schoolwork or other things directly related to academic functioning as opposed to games? That last bullet there, if you want to go to YouTube and search for Nirvonics Insight, you can see a 3-minute overview of an application that Dr. Hamlin and I sort of co-developed that tries to provide this kind of feedback on attentional state for children while they're engaged in educationally relevant activities. Conclusions. Neurofeedback is certainly a promising treatment for ADHD. At this point, I'd say it's really beyond promising, and that positive results from many, many studies really provide parents with the reason to expect benefits from the training. However, there does remain real disagreement within the field about whether the efficacy of neurofeedback for ADHD has been conclusively established, and I will say that really some of the most important researchers in the ADHD field would argue that it has not been conclusively established. The current research support suggests it's best considered as a complement to medication and or behavior therapy rather than as a standalone treatment. And finally, the increasing availability of these inexpensive home-based training options will make neurofeedback more widely available. But as I mentioned, the research based on whether or not these home-based systems are effective is essentially non-existent at this point. In the next 5 years, I'm sure that will begin to change. So I think that's the end of our formal presentation, and now we're happy to take questions. Those are just citations for some of the studies that I reviewed.
Thank you so much. That's a great overview. Tons of questions, a lot of them very pragmatic. So let me start with some of those. They're interesting. How is it possible to do neurofeedback more than once a week? Someone's asking whether if you have a home-based system, it would be beneficial to do it every day.
If I may, it's not only possible, but it's actually recommended.
Really? Okay. So more is better, in other words.
Yeah, much like the practice of learning of forehand in tennis or learning to play the piano, it's much more likely. It's not that you couldn't overdo it. You wouldn't want to spend, as I mentioned, that there's a kind of a time limit, and it wouldn't make sense to extend beyond the time limit. But in terms of frequency of practice, typically the response will be internalized, learned more quickly if the practice is more than once a week.
Oh, that's really interesting. I think, I'm not sure you can answer this question, but I'll try it anyway. There's just such a plethora of options that many people who are on the listening in have said, how do they make sense of them? You know, many different apps and home-based options. and they have a hard time figuring out how to proceed with that. Is there a way to try one, and to see whether it's working, and then try a different one? Do they all do more or less the same thing? How do people who are interested in trying neurofeedback evaluate their options?
And I'll let you answer that.
Yeah,
yeah, I know.
There are certainly a variety of approaches, and different companies making different equipment that have different displays. But in the area of ADD and ADHD, they are doing very similar things.
They are.
And no one has done the comparison. But just like almost every other aspect of our lives, there are people who are going to prefer one approach over another. So it may be preference just in terms of what the display that they're watching or how the feedback primarily is delivered. But one of the things that I think is important, and I often describe myself as a neurofeedback heretic, is that it often will depend more on the clinician providing the neurofeedback than it does the system that's used. You want someone who has experience in working with ADD or ADHD. And they have probably benefited from the experience that they've gained. You would like to have someone who's certified in delivery of the service. If you're choosing someone to see for neurofeedback, you'd like to know that someone's been through the certification process, passed an exam, and have the necessary experience to obtain that. And that would probably be more important than which approach they were using.
Oh, that's very interesting. What is the certification entity? What is the certification that should be looked for?
It's the Biofeedback Certification International Alliance, which is really the only certifying body that's recognized in the area of biofeedback and neurofeedback.
Okay. Can you describe, if parents were to go in office, who gives neurofeedback? How do they find a neurofeedback practitioner? Do they tend to be part of a larger ADHD practice clinic, or is it tend to be psychologists in their own practice? What are the options in terms of in-home neurofeedback?
It's essentially all of the above.
Really? Okay.
You will often see specialty clinics that include neurofeedback, but it will often be an individual provider. I would say in terms of neurofeedback, the number of individual providers far exceed the number that are clinic-based, but primarily because there are many more individual providers than there are clinics. But you will find it in all of those settings.
So making it even tougher for people to evaluate which way to go. Is there something to be said for trying it, and then if it doesn't work, stopping? I think you mentioned that, Dr. Hamlin, at the beginning, not to necessarily commit to a long, a sustained set of sessions.
Right. That's why I think continuing assessment is important. Like in our clinic, every time someone comes in, we ask for if it's a child, we ask for parent feedback, and we also are taking measurements continuously. So we can see if the brain is making the expected changes. And of course, what we would hope to see is the parent reports were reflecting those sorts of changes. And so I think it should be a continual assessment. And yes, it would make perfect sense to say try a number of sessions and see how the child is responding, and or the adult, if it's an adult, to see how they're responding and make a decision about continuing based on the changes that are being observed.
Let me just
sure.
I was just interject a question there. So Ed, would you say that if after 6 sessions or after 10 sessions, if you're not seeing any of the desired changes in the kind of brainwave activity that the client is producing or able to produce, is that typically enough to decide, well, for whatever reason, for this child, it's not going to work, or you can go 10 sessions with nothing and then it just sort of clicks in further down the road?
Yeah, it varies quite a bit from seeing incremental changes almost each session to not seeing much change and then suddenly seeing a change. In my practice, at least, if I'm not seeing any response to training, I'm not seeing the changes in the EEG, and I'm not getting reports from the parents after 10 sessions, I spell those individual differences out to the parents, but I do not necessarily encourage them to continue. They may choose to continue, but I don't necessarily encourage them to continue. One issue that comes up, and again, this is why the skill of the practitioner, this is training, so it is different than taking a medication. As long as you swallow the medication, it probably is going to have whatever effect it's going to have. But getting the person to sometimes, especially with a lot of hyperactivity, the first thing you're doing is just training the child to train. They may not be sitting still very long enough to get a clean and accurate EEG signal. Artifact is the EEG practitioner's primary problem. And if the children are bouncing or fidgeting or things like that, a lot of your first sessions, and maybe your first several sessions, may just be in getting the child to settle down enough to train. And there are techniques for doing that and approaches for doing that. So for that reason, that would be a factor to consider. So it may take 4, 5, even 6 sessions to get the child to be able to engage and train. And so by 8 or 10, you may have only had 3 or 4 sessions where the EEG was actually being trained and not just movement.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really interesting. That makes sense. And there's a comment here from someone named Helen who says her son tried neurofeedback at age 8 and did, quote, a Pac-Man type game. He did 20 sessions but was really bored and seemed to have no effect. So there's a situation that may correspond to what you're saying, where it's not clear that necessarily the child was actually, the EEGs were engaged. Yeah. So, I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds to me like one of the key criterion for parents embarking upon this is the feedback, is whether the practitioner is going to be measuring and monitoring constantly the effectiveness of the treatment.
And I think that's one of the problems with the research that's conducted. We participate in research, but one of the problems in doing research is you really are kind of limited into how much other than the neurofeedback per se that you can do. So approaches you might typically use in the clinic to help a child engage in the feedback process, you really don't. You're pretty limited as to how much you can do during a research study. And so most of the research studies involve using fixed protocols. And as I was mentioning, when you take measurements, you may find out that the approach you might use for a different child wouldn't be expected to be effective for this child. But when you're doing a research outcome, you typically have to use the same protocol for everybody. So it limits some of the outcomes that you see when you're actually working with someone in a clinic. You're usually working with the parents, you're working with the child, and doing a lot more coaching and encouraging than probably goes on in most of the formal studies.
And certainly in the home-based practice.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that would be right. So I just want to jump to some of the other interesting questions. Apparently, and I have to say that I didn't know this, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends neurofeedback, or does so, since 2012. Is that accurate? And there are questions as to how they came to that conclusion.
Yeah, so back in 2012, there's an organization that the American Academy of Pediatrics, I guess, sort of is allied with or contracts with. I don't know the nature of the relationship. What they did was to essentially to sort of rate the evidence for different types of interventions, for different types of sort of child mental health conditions. And in that 2012 rating, they essentially placed neurofeedback for ADHD. I think the term they used was EEG biofeedback as kind of a level 1 best evidence intervention for ADHD. I think people in the neurofeedback community were, I would say, probably pleasantly surprised by that. I think that, many people, myself included, and I actually, I would say a supporter of neurofeedback in the sense that, it's something that if I had a child with ADHD, I would certainly decide to give it a try. I think there were people who felt that that they got ahead of themselves there with that rating, and so it was very exciting for the field. I think it was a bit controversial,
right?
And yeah.
So based on the helpful review of the research isn't quite there yet to say affirmatively that this is a recommended treatment, I think is what you're saying. So question that I find interesting about which symptoms of ADHD are most positively affected by neurofeedback. Is it inattention versus hyperactivity? These are questions from a number of people that I'm combining. Is executive function, can it be affected? Social skills? Any sense of how neurofeedback, what kinds of symptoms are most likely to be affected positively by successful neurofeedback?
Most of the studies that have been done have shown a stronger effect on attention, but a relatively strong effect on the hyperactivity component as well. We've just finished a study that wasn't specifically with ADD. It was with children who had adverse events in their life in their early childhood. That certainly shows up as attention problems as well. Many of those children get diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. And the finding that came in the study that we're just going to be presenting the data in about a month now showed improvements in executive functioning. So I think someone mentioned that specifically.
Right, yes.
And so, the executive functioning is a little better self-control in terms of in terms of your impulse management, but also just things. Parents will often report that their child's memory has improved, and it really isn't necessarily that their memory has improved. It's just that if you pay attention to something better, you are more likely to remember it. But frequently they start talking about, they're remembering their assignments that they were previously forgetting that they needed to do, and things like that.
Interesting. Sort of mindfulness.
Yes.
Enhanced. Okay. So a couple of questions about: are there any negatives? Is there any adverse effect that you've seen in clients given with neurofeedback?
But there can certainly be temporary. There can be temporary effects, and that's one of the. I think that's one of the problems with many of the studies done where you used a fixed protocol, so every person got the same feedback parameters were being addressed. In the clinical setting, you actually adjust based on a person's response. So it's not a one-size-fits-all proposition for many people. And so there can be temporary effects of being either tired, excessively tired after doing that persists some after the session, or kind of excessively wired. And for either of those things, you can typically make adjustments. Most of our equipment most of the equipment that we use, all of the equipment we use in our clinic, and much of the equipment that's in use out there has been FDA approved. And they did their due diligence research, and the FDA was not able to find a single incident of lasting adverse effects.
Okay.
Let me just follow up there, Susan. It's not really an adverse effect of the treatment per se, but something that is important to consider is if a parent, for example, approaches this. Let's say there's a parent who's, for whatever reason, has real concerns about starting their child on medication. And let's say their child is really sort of highly symptomatic. And if the idea is, well, I'm gonna try neurofeedback first, and if it doesn't work, then I'll consider it. Well, again, it can be 6, 8, 12 weeks, whatever. And if it doesn't work, there can be an adverse effects from delaying the initiation of a treatment that could have been more effective.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that sort of correlates to some questions here that relate to, can neurofeedback replace medication? Can neurofeedback allow medication to be discontinued? I'm guessing that we don't know that at this point.
Well, that was essentially the Vince Monastro study that that David described, where all the children were taking medication.
Right.
And half of them added neurofeedback.
Okay.
And then after the medication was discontinued, the group that only had medication reverted to the pre-treatment measures, and the group that had neurofeedback actually maintained their gains. So,
interesting.
Because prior to that study, I used to put parents in the uncomfortable position of having to decide whether or not to use medication or neurofeedback, and so I'm very appreciative for that study.
Right.
And Susan, there have been published studies, including some fairly recently, that have shown that neurofeedback can contribute to lower doses of medication, or certainly to obviate the need to increase dosages in kids.
Okay.
So like everything, right, nothing works for everybody, and so,
right.
It's impossible to make a blanket statement like, yes, if your child is on neurofeedback, they won't need meds or they'll need lower doses. But there are studies that show that on average that can be the case.
Okay, makes sense. Running out of time, lots of good questions. Is neurofeedback equally helpful, in your opinion, to adults as it is to children? And the sort of corollary question people are asking, are children's brains more plastic? Do they respond better than adult brains to something like neurofeedback?
Well, we see probably as many adults in our clinic as we do children. Children, your brain remains plastic throughout your life, but it is more plastic the younger you are. So I actually think that you will see a reduced number of sessions, training sessions required in children. They often pick this up much quicker. They also are less skeptical and ask fewer questions about it, and so sometimes that also speeds things up a bit.
That's interesting. Lots of questions about how to find a neurofeedback practitioner, and I guess what I'm hearing from this, what I'm taking away from this session, that it's pretty important to find an experienced practitioner who will optimize the chances that the treatment's successful, provide good feedback, be certified. Is there an organization? Is there a way, an optimal way to find excellent neurofeedback practitioner?
Word of mouth is helpful, but in the absence of that, of someone who's had a positive experience, in the absence of that, the certifying body it's a bcia.org. We'll have a list of certified people that are in particular areas, so you can look by your area and find someone who's certified.
Good idea. So thank you all so much. So this has been eye-opening for me. I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listeners did as well. And thanks to Play Attention, the sponsor of this webinar, and to both of you for your work in the field. I think it's got lots of possibilities for our readers and listeners. Thanks, everybody. We're signing off.
For more Attitude Podcast and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.